Welcome to the Paradigm Shift on 4ZZZ 102.1, where we challenge the assumptions of our current society to resist depression and investigate alternative ways of living, for a world based on justice, solidarity and sustainability. Welcome to the Paradigm Shift on 4ZZZ 102.1 FM. You are tuned into your local community, non-profit, volunteer-run station. My name's Andy and I will be hanging out with you for the next hour. I'm coming to you this week from back in Australia, but a long way from Brisbane, down on the Murray River in Yorta Yorta country. And if you have regularly been listening to the start of this show over the last year or two, you would know that I do like to travel around a bit, and I'm interested in places, and I'm interested in what it means to relate to country, as we might say. You know, watch how the interplay between place and ourselves and the communities that we make, and how these things affect each other. Now, some people have called this line of thinking psychogeography. It was a term coined by the Situationists, a group of French radical artists in the 1950s and 60s. And I think for them it was a way of finding what else is possible. You know, how can we intervene in the humdrum of industrial capitalism to capture our imaginations and think about what else could be possible. And one of them was trying to look actually at what is under your nose, but what you ignore because we're just taught to think about what's profitable or what help us gain some level of status or convenience or something like that. So they came up with this idea of psychogeography as a practice, and it's influenced different people in the half a century since then, including two Australian writers who I will be interviewing on today's show. One of them is Vanessa Berry, who writes the Mirror Sydney blog about her excursions around Sydney, kind of exploring the places, a lot of the sort of neglected places and some of the forgotten history of that town. Another is Nick Gadd, who does a similar thing in Melbourne and also has a blog called Melbourne Circle, and also has written a book by that name. So we're going to be exploring a few different places. One week maybe I'll do a psychogeography in Brisbane show, but I do think it's interesting and useful for us to read about people doing it in different places, particularly in Australia. I also am a psychogeography enthusiast. Going back a few years, I did write a zine about psychogeography in Brisbane, particularly about development and how it affects our ability to form communities that aren't based around private profits and things like that. And I just like thinking about it and reading other people thinking about it. So that's why we're going to be talking about psychogeography on the show today. Now, the two practitioners I've got on the show are both people who do it in a very easy to understand, kind of popular way, trying to encourage everybody to do it. There is another strand of highly intellectualized writing and thinking about psychogeography, particularly in the UK, people like Will Self and Ian Sinclair. I did think about including a little speech from Will Self, but I don't think we'll get time in today's show. But that's also another element of it, very kind of academic and intellectual exploration of things, and sometimes people get into a sort of mystic or spiritual reading of places and their significance, which is a part of it as well. And of course, in Australia, there's a very long history of people connecting very deeply with the spirit of place as well, so that's very useful. One of the other situationist concepts, which I think comes up in some of these interviews, and so I'll just quickly demystify, is that of the dérive, which was their suggestion that people take walks with no plan and no phone or map or anything, but just guided by the city's contours to wander through the city and explore what things take their fancy. And I think that in particular has informed both Nick Gadd and Vanessa Berry. So without dawdling around on this radio show anymore, let's get into the interviews. We'll start with Vanessa Berry.
Hello, I'm Vanessa Berry. I'm a writer and a zine maker from Sydney.
And today I've got you on the show because we're going to talk about psychogeography, and you are a self-professed psychogeography practitioner, but it's one of those very vague terms, so I wonder if you can start off by giving us a bit of a definition of what it means for you.
Sure. Well, it is one of those terms that can be as complicated or as simple as you want to make it. For me, it's about being kind of observational and receptive to atmospheres as I walk around the city or urban environments. So it's very much about walking or being in places that perhaps are a little bit lesser noticed or a bit on the margins, or even just picking up more unusual or unexpected moods or atmospheres in places that are very well known. I think I've done this for a very long time. I started when I moved into the inner city as a younger person, when I moved out of home. So this is in Sydney. And I was just drawn to places that were abandoned or unusual in some way. There's less and less of them now in Sydney, but this is back in the 1990s, and there was more kind of vacant lots and spooky abandoned buildings and those kinds of places. So I did a lot of walking around in those kinds of environments. And I don't think I heard the term psychogeography until I went to university, and the actual term comes from the 1960s when the artists and activists, the situationists, developed that term. They were a Parisian artist and activist group. But I felt like when I encountered it, I was like, oh, okay, I know what that is. I kind of already do it. I just don't call it that. And so I think that's the kind of relationship a lot of people have with it.
So your blog that you write now, and a book, in fact, as well, called Mirror Sydney, is your own kind of experiment in sharing your psychogeographic excursions. Can you tell us about the blog and what you do?
Sure. Well, I started the blog in 2012, and so I've written about Sydney a lot in all my writing. So I started writing through making zines in the mid-1990s, and they were they weren't focused on places in particular, but they were autobiographical zines. So I wrote a lot about my life, which was doing those kinds of things I mentioned earlier, wandering around in the inner city and stuff like that. So I'd always had a bit of a presence of Sydney in my writing, but I wanted to start a project that really focused on the particular places I really loved. And now the kind of general identity of Sydney isn't as this kind of more introverted or spooky kind of place. It's usually as more of a kind of an extroverted and wealthy and brash kind of place in sort of more general mainstream media, I guess. But it wasn't the way that I really experienced Sydney at all. And I knew a lot of other people felt that way too. And I thought I'd start the blog just as a way to celebrate some of the places I really loved, and also to encourage other people to go on investigations of places they loved. And it tended to be places in the suburbs or like quite a few abandoned theme parks arose in the first few years, or just suburban oddities. So that blog, it's still living now, but I kept it for about 5 years before it was published as a book. So the book came out in 2017, and that was some of the places from the blog, the most popular ones or ones that were my favourites that I continued to work on and made into longer pieces for the book. And I also drew maps for the book.
Yeah, it's interesting what you mentioned about Sydney and its general character, which is, for one, is extremely rushed. Everybody's in a rush in Sydney. The traffic's bad, everything, and there isn't much kind of stopping to observe and enjoy necessarily. But also there is this thing of Sydney being this big world city and a kind of somewhat, I guess, faceless place in a big city where everybody's rushing around and things are expensive and things like that. And I guess Paris would have been probably the same for the Situationists. Is psychogeography kind of a reaction against that, the idea that the city is this big thing that we have no kind of control over or no individual place in?
Oh, yeah, definitely. And I mean, one of the things with the Situationists, they were activists, like they were making these investigations of the city because they wanted it to change. And one of the ways that they thought they could change it was by applying imagination to it and imagining how it could be thought of differently. I think a lot of people who call themselves psychogeographers or whose creative work is inspired by it have this relationship to imagination. I mean, I certainly do in my work. I mean, I would hate to think that all Sydney was, this place that I've lived my entire life, that all it was a place where people rush around and, are forced to spend lots of money and feel like there's no space in their lives. And I think, definitely elements of that that's not untrue. But you can also exercise resistance by slowing down or by choosing to pay attention to different things, to the things that you're kind of being asked to pay attention to, just kind of generally on the street or through mainstream media, I guess. So, yeah, it's definitely a resistant act. And in keeping with practices like, slowing down and paying attention and things that people are talking about a lot more, I think, in the last, say, 5 or 10 years. There was a great book by Jenny Odell called How to Do Nothing. So she's from San Francisco, and she wrote a book about resisting the attention economy, sort of switching off from social media and things like that, and talking about the power of paying attention. She particularly talks about bird watching, but it doesn't have to be something that's so connected to the natural environment even. I think fundamentally it's just about paying more attention, and psychogeography definitely does that. It's a way of making the familiar strange sometimes, I think, or just by being a bit quieter and more reflective and going, actually, maybe I'm not going to join this great rush of people charging on to wherever. If I just step to the side and have a bit of a look at what's over here, maybe there'll be something interesting, and I can take even just a few minutes to see where some path leads or go into some kind of hidden arcade. I still find things that I've never found before in the city and the suburbs, even though I've lived here all my life, just by being curious.
You mentioned the political side of it there, and I think that's something I'm quite interested in, that the Situationists were openly political. They were socialists. They were involved in the May 68 uprising in France and things like that. And for them, it was quite a political act. And I think when people reference it now, they don't always sort of seem to think of it, express it as a kind of political thing. Do you think in your work that there's a political element to it, to trying to change the city you're in as well?
Yeah, I mean, I think that act of what you pay attention to is a very powerful act, and by suggesting that you can pay attention to these other elements of the city, the ones that you're perhaps not meant to notice or are thought to be redundant or unusual, is a way to get you to think about how you might want the city to be otherwise. And it also is, I mean, one of the things about Sydney is it has this great drive towards reinvention. So places are demolished and new places are constructed, and then they're demolished and then they'll try it again. And there's this sense of, that sort of sense of things being made continually new with a lack of reflection sometimes. So what psychogeography does is enable reflection. So perhaps it's not, I wouldn't describe it as a hard political stance, but it's certainly more of that everyday politics and thinking about, where you put your energies, where you put your attention to. And I do try to change people's point of view or way of looking at the city in quite subtle ways through kind of showing my own way of doing it. I mean, I think that idea of there being sort of secret or hidden sides to the city is really engaging for people, and that can often be a way in for people who, they might not think of themselves as particularly political people, but that's a way to get people interested in thinking, how did this place get to be the way it is, and what kind of inequalities does it show up and things like that. So I guess it's a softer approach, but I think that connection is definitely still there.
Your work does often I guess, focus on the history, like you've kind of said, sort of hidden histories. It reminds me a bit of another hard to define term, which is hauntology, if you're familiar with that, like kind of looking at what does the past say about their idea of a future that they built for that sort of is different to our present or something. So I wonder about how you feel like the interplay of your exploration of the history of these places goes with, I guess, an experience of the present, or like a looking forward toward the future of the place where you live.
Yeah, well, I think that idea of hauntology is one that's very interesting to me, as well as psychogeography, and that idea about what kind of traces or echoes of the past exist in the present, and that interplay of absence and presence, like what traces remain and which ones are there if you dig a little bit, and what can that reveal. And so, yeah, I mean, with using history, like whenever I write about a place, I'll read a lot, but I'll be very selective about what I choose to include, because I'm not a historian. I'm not writing a history of the place. So I'll choose usually particular details that have some kind of resonance in the present day experience of the place. So they provide some history of the place, but I wouldn't call them really histories of the place. They bring history in where needed. But I think it just all helps to enrich your understanding of the place that you move through, and sometimes seeing what kind of changes places have been through helps you to think about what you might want a place to be in the future, or see how things are changing. So thinking about time in a dynamic way. And of course, when you walk through a city, anywhere we're walking in any city in Australia, we're walking on ancient Aboriginal land, and all of the fixtures of the city are really very temporary and recent things, really. And so that there's so many layers of time in any one place, and sometimes we can see those, especially in Sydney, where there's the topography is really present. So it's got lots of hills, and it's not like, just to compare it to Melbourne, which is a very flat city, for example. Sydney, it doesn't have that similar kind of drama of how the streets move around. And so I always feel like that's kind of a link to the kind of deeper time of the place. And then obviously on the streets walking around, there's things like ghost signs, which might indicate a history is, say, 50 or 100 years old. And then there's just completely new things where what's been there before has just been wiped away, and there's some big new shiny building there which might be hideously ugly or look okay. They really vary.
So how do you think your own explorations in psychogeography have kind of added to your understanding of the city, or your place in it, or yourself as an individual?
I feel really proud of having recorded some of the places which have now disappeared. So when I started in Sydney, that was more than 10 years ago now. A lot of the places that I wrote about then have changed or disappeared, and that's not to say I think they shouldn't have. I mean, often there were places that weren't going to be heritage protected or anything, and they were dilapidated, or they just weren't going to stick around, but they are significant to people in different ways, and I feel happy that I was able to record them, and having it as a blog means people can potentially look it up in however many years' time, and if they remember something and there's still that information there. So, I mean, it might not be world-changing or life-changing, but I like to think it enriches people's sense of place and feeling of attachment to places in the city and the suburbs, and that's important. I mean, if you care about the place where you live, you're much more likely to care about what happens to it and the people in it, and it being a good place to live for everyone. Hopefully, maybe that's a bit idealist, but that's the bigger picture driving it, I think.
All right. Well, if people are interested in reading Mirror Sydney, how can they do that?
Well, Google the blog. Just Google Mirror Sydney, Vanessa Berry, and you will find it. And it's also available as a book. But if you go to the blog, there's a link to the book as well. And you can buy it through bookstores online or your independent bookstore.
All right. Thanks very much, Vanessa.
Thanks, Andy. It's been nice to talk to you.
You are listening to The Paradigm Shift on 4ZZZ 102.1 FM. We were talking with Vanessa Berry, who through her blog and book Mirror Sydney explore what we might call psychogeography, the interplay between place and being, I guess, our mental states. And you can, of course, read that by heading to her blog and check out some of her wanderings around Sydney's lesser-known parts. And I've quite enjoyed it. I mean, I have lived in Sydney, and so it is of interest to me, maybe more so than other people. But I'm sure if that interview has piqued your interest, then you'll find plenty more there. Now, another prominent Australian blogger and book writer who calls himself a psychogeographer is Nick Gadd. He does a bit of a similar thing to Vanessa in that he walked around his city of Melbourne, picked a kind of plot to circumnavigate the city, and then he just wrote about what he would see and feel in different places. And then it also became a book, although the context changed because his wife, who had been his walking partner, had passed away, and so the book also became about his personal feelings of these places, given that he shared that experience. So in this way, Nick is channeling a bit of the situationists in their idea of the dérive, taking these unstructured walks through the city to see what you come across and how it affects you. And so I thought I would have a chat to him too.
My name's Nick Gadd. I'm a writer from Melbourne and the author of the book Melbourne Circle.
So I'm talking to you today because on the show we are talking about psychogeography, which is a seldom used and hard to define term. Could we start off by saying, what does psychogeography mean for you?
You're right. It's a term that is much used by different people to mean different things. For me, it's a way of exploring urban environments and especially trying to understand or connect with the layers of stories that exist in a city or in a suburb, especially seeking access to things about it which are secret, hidden, lost, or in some way interesting, especially if those things engage with the emotional lives of people.
Yeah, so let's talk about Melbourne Circle and your practice of psychogeography. It's a blog and a book. Can you tell us about what you do in Melbourne Circle?
So it originated as a blog, and what I did was, along with my wife, Lynn, we walked around the whole city of Melbourne in a series of connected walks over 2 years, looking for things that were of interest to us, things that were like old bits of signage, curious bits of architecture, interesting buildings, the sort of things that you might walk past 1,000 times and not notice or not pay attention to. That's what we were looking for, like some old faded lettering on a wall. We'd look at that and think, well, what is that? What does it say? And what can it tell us about the building, about the history of this place? And we were investigating the kind of layered stories of the city of Melbourne. And I wrote a series of blog posts about that, about those walks, which I called Melbourne Circle, because all the walks eventually connected up into this circle around the city. And that later then became the book Melbourne Circle, Walking, Memory and Loss. And I was particularly interested in themes of loss and memory. I should also mention that Lynn, my wife, passed away in 2018. And so the book is also about grief and about personal loss, and the way our story intersects with the story of the city and the history of the city.
Yeah, it's very interesting, the personal angle of you writing about the loss of your wife, and I guess the way that you relate to the city differently, having done those walks with your wife. And it is interesting then extending that to loss, like that a city is constantly dynamic and changing, but we have these personal associations with it, so that when it changes, there's this part of ourself that is lost. It's a very interesting a way that we each experience a place, isn't it?
It is really interesting. It's very complicated, I think. And what I've done in Melbourne Circle in my book is just try to tease out some of those aspects of it. I mean, like, we all have places in a city that are of personal importance to us. You know, in a sense, we all have our own special spots. We all have our own maps of the city, you know, in our heads. You know, this is the place where something important happened, something good happened here, something bad happened here. And that is not the same for any two people. It's always different. And then, but then every time you go out on one of these walks, on one of these journeys, kind of paying attention, you're sort of creating a new history as well.
It is one of the interesting dynamics of a city in that there's millions of people that live there, but also it is the city of millions of individual people, and you know, these things, there's a push and pull between different people's experience of a city and different people's desires. It's quite a fascinating topic to explore.
Yeah, it is. I think each of us has our own city in a way, but it's good sometimes also to step out of that, to step out of your usual path and go off and explore new parts of the city, perhaps take a different route to work if you go to work, or just get off the train at a different station and be observant. And in Melbourne, we had much of the last 2 years we spent locked down, and in that time we weren't able to go more than 5 kilometres away from our houses for quite a bit of the time because of the COVID. And in that time, a lot of people did start walking around their own neighbourhoods because you couldn't actually go perhaps to the as far as you were used to going. And in that time, people actually began to observe that there were many things of interest in their local neighbourhoods that perhaps they hadn't seen before on their own doorsteps. So there's that aspect to it too, is of finding the unfamiliar in what you thought was familiar.
Let's talk about ghost signs, which is a frequent part of your blog and writing. What do you find interesting about ghost signs?
Yeah, so ghost signs are old signage representing people and businesses and organisations that no longer exist, basically. And we have many of these in Melbourne, especially around the older suburbs. And what I find fascinating about them is that they're like a window back into the past. So you see a sign for something like Melbourne Steamship Company, for example, a huge sign, painted sign on a brick wall. And of course, the Melbourne Steamship Company doesn't exist anymore. So you can go off and do a bit of research and find out about that company, and it might lead you back into a really interesting story. I mean, in the book, I talk about a sign that I saw for a man called Dr. King. And this was a ghost sign that appeared on a wall in Melbourne saying, "Consult the celebrated specialist Dr. King." And the sign dated from about 1890, so more than 100 years old. And I wanted to know who Dr. King was. So I went and did some research, and it's quite a long story, but I discovered he was a 19th century doctor who also practiced as a medical clairvoyant. And the idea was you could send him a lock of your hair or a letter or some personal belonging, and he would diagnose you from that. And so it was quite an interesting story, not just about that individual, but also about the culture of Melbourne at the time in the 1890s, which was, you know, before doctors were regulated. Basically, anybody could set themselves up in medical practice.
Sounds kind of similar to the internet now.
It is kind of like that, yeah. And he would have been right at home on the internet, I think, Dr. King. He was quite a self-promoter. And so ghost signs can lead you back into these interesting little highways and byways. And there are so many signs around Melbourne for lost products like Wolf's Schnapps and Otis tonic tablets and these old medicines which no longer exist anymore. And also another thing I like about ghost signs is that often they can be really quite beautiful. There can be beautiful painted examples of the sign writer's craft, sometimes with some really beautiful lettering. And the fact that they've faded gives them an atmosphere which makes them quite intriguing and enigmatic, especially if they start to fade away and they're quite difficult to read. It becomes like looking at a puzzle, a crossword puzzle on the walls. And once you do start seeing these things, you see them everywhere. That's what I've noticed, and what a lot of people have said to me. Once you actually start paying attention to old signage, suddenly you see it all over the place.
Quite a few people that are into psychogeography are into these like traces of the past that you find, or sort of learning the histories of places. What do you think seeing these things from the past contributes to our understanding of the present, or our imagining the future?
Well, that's a really interesting question, Andy. I think for me it's about a sense of understanding who's gone before, what the layers of history are in a place, the way places have changed, the fact that cities are these living organisms, they're not static in any way. Like if you go in parts of Melbourne, for example, you'll see signage for the shoe industry, which points back to a time when Melbourne had a very substantial shoemaking sector, which now doesn't exist anymore. There are occupations that used to exist which don't exist anymore. You see them advertised around the city. It gives you a sense, I think, these things evolve, but also that we have choices. There were times when we set out to build up manufacturing industry. There were other times when we decided basically to move it all offshore. And now we look around and we see the masses of development that are going on, and you wonder how much real planning has gone into that. And I think sometimes if people had more sense of the history of a place, then they would think more carefully about what they do now and what we build on it now. In the process of writing Melbourne Circle, I did uncover some pretty hair-raising stories about toxic dumps, for example, industries just dumping arsenic and other very toxic products in the ground with no thought for the future, really. So that stuff is still there. There are parts of Melbourne, the Melbourne suburbs, where you just can't build anything now because there's so much toxic waste in the ground, and people just dumped it there without thinking about it, and then sealed it over, not particularly well, and left it there. So I think thinking about the city like this makes you aware that there are choices, and there are things that we do now that are going to have a big effect in the future, and it's just good to understand your city. It's just good to understand the place that you live a bit more, not just kind of walk around looking sort of at your own little bit of it, but kind of raise your eyes and look up, and then try to even look down into the ground and understand it a bit more deeply. That's what I get out of it anyway.
Well, that was going to be my next question, is what do you personally think you've got out of doing Melbourne Circle?
I think a personal sense of, everything I said before, but also a personal sense of what my connection is with this place. I believe that one of the things that gives meaning to our lives is our connections with specific places. And the more understanding you have of that in all kinds of ways. And the way I do it is just one way of doing it. People have many ways of doing it. But the more understanding that you have of the place where you live, it kind of enriches your life, and hopefully gives you more understanding and more love for the place where you are. And I think that's a good thing.
Okay, if people are interested in reading Melbourne Circle, how can they do that?
Well, the blog, Melbourne Circle, you'll find easily online, and my book is called Melbourne Circle, Walking Memory and Loss by Nick Gadd, and if you Google that, you should be able to either order it online or ask your bookshop to get it in for you.
Okay, thanks very much for chatting with us, Nick.
Thanks, Andy. It's been a pleasure.
On the Paradigm Shift on 4ZZZ, Nick Gadd. He's the author of Melbourne Circle, where he walks around the city. It's a lot about ghost signs and about kind of seeing the traces of an old Melbourne left in this new and shiny city. But there's lots of different ways to explore the place that you live in and how we relate to it. I find it quite an endlessly fascinating topic, and it is endless, right? Because, you know, each city, Brisbane has 2 million people or whatever, and so it's times 2 million, the different cities that exist here, you know, each different people's experience of it, and all the history of people that have come before, and the things they built, or the things that they wanted to build that didn't come to pass, and the way that they're remembered or the way that they're forgotten. You know, all these things combine together to make the place where we live and the community, the city that we are in now, and us, of course, as individuals who are formed partially by our surroundings. And so I encourage you to start doing your own exploring, and part of it as well is getting out of the geography of commerce, right? These paths that are made for us to go between, you know, our home to our work to the shopping centre, and always guided by, you know, the advertisers telling us where to go, where to hang out, what stuff to buy, or even Google Maps, you know, telling us the best route or whatever. It might not be the most interesting route, and who knows what you'll find if you just take the time to look around and explore a bit. And so I hope this show has inspired you a bit to explore your surroundings, and not just the place they are, I think, but the place they could be. To me, that's really key about it, is that part of it is thinking about what are the good things, what are the things we love, how can we protect them, how can we share them with others and sustain them for future generations and things like that. And it is about imagining the city that we want, as well as discovering the city that we have. And it can help us sometimes to look deep into the past as well. We have talked today on the show about Aboriginal connections to country, and it is one of the famous ways, I guess, in this continent that people do connect with the surroundings, is this kind of traditional Aboriginal spirituality. And that's been very inspiring to me over the years as well. But I think as well, we should demystify that, right? And it be everybody lives in a place, right? Everybody is sustained by the land around them, partially, you know, the trees that are creating oxygen, the soil nutrients that are going into our food, the shelter that we have, and things like that. And so everybody can take the time to appreciate that, to connect with it. And I think Thelma Plum, she's an Aboriginal woman, but she is Gamilaroi, right? The big river in her country is the Namoi, but in this song, the Brown Snake, she's exploring Brisbane River, or Maiwa, as it is known traditionally. And so all of us can do that, you know, and we can appreciate our surroundings, and we can look after them and see what clues they might hold for how we can live better. See you next week.